And our third speaker for this session is American photographer Joel Sternfeld. I'm very honored to be here in conversation with you today. His work, I don't think it needs much of an introduction, but it's deeply concerned with the utopian and dystopian aspects of American culture and beyond, not just American culture. Joel recently is here to present 3 books, not just one, 3, all which title a new definitive version, I would say, of American Prospects that was first published in 1987, this legendary work on American landscape mentality, etc. Rome After Rome, also a sequel, let's say, of his Campagna Romana from 1992, and Our Loss, which is perhaps the most moving of the 3. And so my question would be, why these 3 books now together? How do they relate with each other? Thank you.
Do you mind if I stand up? It makes me feel like I'm saying something important. Do you mind?
Please do.
Yeah. So, you know, here are 3 books with the work made over a 40-year span. And we're already in Rome, but I want to talk about American Prospects first, because that's the book that I did in the late 70s and early 80s when I first began to travel for long, long periods of time in the United States. And as I did, even before I left New York City, I had this idea that something was going on in America. You know, I grew up long ago when there was Life magazine and the Reader's Digest and that vision of America that everything was great and the American mythology of greatness. But in the 70s, the Vietnam War was still fresh in memory. The Watergate hearings and the impeachment of Nixon was still very fresh in memory. There was a very sharp economic recession in 1976, the bicentennial year of the United States. So there was a feeling, an undercurrent, if you will, of something being amiss. And the real pullout on that is, in 1979, Jimmy Carter went up to Camp David for a retreat for 10 days, an extraordinary thing for an American president to say he's going up to think. And during those 10 days, he snuck out and he went to the home of a steel worker in Pittsburgh to get the viewpoints of a real American. And then he came back to Washington and he delivered a speech in which he announced that there was a malaise in America. First of all, good use of a French word, but secondly, you don't tell Americans that there's a malaise. That's not what they want to hear. And I think that was directly contributory to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So when I set out from New York, I was working with this notion of something being wrong, not necessarily a malaise, but maybe something even deeper. And all those pictures that you see of mudslides and a house on fire and the beached whales were not random. It's not as if I knew that I would be making those pictures, but when those things occurred, they fit within a general sense that I already had with me when I left New York. And many, many other things too. You know, American Prospects has a very, very complicated set of ideas working in it. For example, there's a picture, I guess, downstairs of an aircraft carrier. As Reagan became the president, I started doing things about military. There was a sharp economic recession in 1982. I made pictures of people living in tents outside of Houston. I was pointing out things about the economic inequality, the conspicuous consumption that Reagan made fashionable, and also the disdain for American labor. There was an air traffic controller strike early in the Reagan era, and Reagan hired all new workers. He didn't give in to the strikers. And that was a signal that labor was not going to be honored by Republicans in America. I think you can draw a straight line from that moment in American history to Trump and to the present moment. But let me not jump ahead. I'll just tell you a little bit about the book about Rome, a very little bit, and that is that after I finished American Prospects in 1987, I started to do the portraits that would eventually become Stranger Passing. And if you know them, I did the 2 summer interns on Wall Street. I did the bankers. I was making pictures, and I showed them at my then gallery, Pace McGill, and someone came up to me after the opening and said, "I didn't know you were so angry." And I didn't know that I was that angry. And it really startled me. And I felt like I had to clear my head, that I had the American experience in my teeth, in my hair, that I was too close to it, and I needed to get out of America. And so I went to Rome. And that wasn't random either. Am I taking too long? It's okay?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
We're fine.
So I went to Rome because I was looking for a symbolic place, a symbolic site. Rome has always been symbolic of, ever since the fall, of decline of a civilization. Rome was the world, and it fell. And I wanted to comment on that. And also, the Campagna is where Western civilization gets its painterly image of utopia. All the painters, Corot, Turner, Cole, all the Western landscapists went to the Campagna, and they tried to make it out to be a utopia, even though it was largely a malarial swamp with tombs. But that's art history for you. So in any case, I went to Rome to suggest that Rome was the world, it fell. By this time, the evidence of climate change was really abundant. James Hansen, the leading scientist, testified before Congress in June 1988 on a hot day that global warming was occurring. And my first motive in going to Rome, besides the pasta, was to suggest that things can change in an extraordinary way.
And how did you find these modern Romans? How do they relate with this failed empire?
Well, for me, and you know more about it than I do, I think the Romans make a distinction between themselves now and the ancients. There's no sense of, we are the Romans, the glorious past belongs to me. There's a kind of otherization, and they don't identify with ancient Rome. But there's still, everywhere you go, that Italian great love of beauty. You know, I was out in the suburbs, which are quite banal, and I was talking to a group of little boys who had been removed from the centro, and I said to them, "How do you like it out here?" And in Italian, this little boy said to me, no good. And I said, why? He said, Roma è bella, qui non bella. There's still that, every Italian has a sense of beauty, but that's a separate matter. Anyway, I did the work in Rome, and then fast forward a year and a half ago, I was in Prospect Park on April 14th, 2018. It was a memorable day. It was the first really great day of spring in New York City. And my little boy and I went for a walk in the park, which is an accomplishment because he's not an easy child to get off the couch on the weekends. And we went to the park, and he was behaving just like a boy should, climbing trees and rocks and putting sticks in the pond. I was just looking at the pictures on my iPhone, and it was, the downy woodpeckers were migrating through New York City. The buds were this big on certain flora that was growing, and we had just a marvelous afternoon. And I came home that night. I live 3 blocks from the park. And I came home and I heard the news about David Buckle. Buckle was an attorney, a leading attorney in the fight for gay rights in America, for marriage equality. And he had set himself on fire that morning as a means of calling attention to the pollution of the planet by fossil fuels. And I wasn't going to go see the place. It's the same thing like when I did American Prospects. I made the photograph of the whales, and then I sat in Portland for a week writing letters and fixing the car. And the day I set out from Portland to go up to Seattle, the news came about this elephant that had run away. And I didn't want to see it. The whales were upsetting enough. I didn't want to see it. But in the end, I turned off the road. It was only a mile off the highway, and I made the photograph of the elephant. Sort of the same thing with this. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go. And then my little boy had a play date with one of his friends on the opposite side of the park, and these people lived about 3 blocks from the very place where David Buckle took his life. And so I went with very mixed feelings because, well, you can imagine all the feelings, particularly the idea of anything that endorses suicide as a means of approaching climate change. And then for a few weeks, I went through this approach avoidance of I'm not going to go, I'm not going to go. I went, I'm not going to go. And then finally, maybe the cycle of the seasons themselves, which is the central animating force in my entire life, took over. And I just kept going back and going back, always with the same camera, the very same lens. I was afraid to do anything else. I just used the first camera that I could grab. And it's very hard to describe the emotions because they're still pretty fresh. I was a bit of a wreck. I vowed to work for 1 year and 1 year only. I'm of Jewish origins, and in the Jewish tradition, you mourn for 1 year, and then you're supposed to, in some ways, move on. And so I felt like I would mourn for 1 year, and then I'd move on. And then one night, about 2 weeks after I stopped photographing, I had a dream that David Buckle's husband wanted me to photograph the little grove of trees that had been planted in his memory. And I went out to the spot that morning and I set up the camera on a tripod, And the minute I did, his husband came up to me. We had seen each other over the year, but never talked. And we had a wonderful conversation, and that's the last picture in the book. So I think there is, for me, a straight line between these three books, from thinking something's wrong in America to suggesting that civilizations can fall, to the present moment when the world is in desperate trouble. And that's how I link the books.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Is there any question from the public? No? Then I'll ask one. Yeah, sure.
How did you find shifting, you obviously know America very well. How did you find shifting from photographing a country you know intimately to, I'm assuming, to a culture you have no sort of attachment to?
Well, do you all hear the question, what's it like to what was it like for me to photograph in America where I know the country, to working outside of Rome? And I'll add to your question by saying I do believe that the day of the colonialist photographer, especially the great white male colonialist photographer, going out and showing us Africa or India or Brazil, is over. So I justified going to Rome because I wasn't commenting on Rome per se, but the tradition of the straneri, the strangers, the painters who had come to Rome. In many cases, I'm making pictures of the very same landscape that they painted. In some cases, I'm standing exactly where Corot stood, exactly where Thomas Cole stood. So I felt like I was commenting on how they had idealized ancient Rome and made it this utopia, and I purposely included the apartment houses, all the signifiers of modernity, if you will. And still I'm willing to believe that I got it wrong, because an outsider is an outsider.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? No? Are you signing these 3 books at Steidel's stand, I can assume?
Right now.
Right now, perfect. So feel free to join him in this.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for your time.